In none of the prior lessons have we said anything about teaching students how to answer multiple choice questions. None of our objectives involved performance that required answering multiple choice questions. None of our teaching strategies involved teaching students how to answer multiple choice questions. So why is it that we so often use multiple choice questions to assess student learning? This is what a typical student looks like taking a test. Does failing a test where you have to name the parts of an engine mean you can't change the oil in that engine? Does getting an A on a quiz where you have to answer multiple choice questions about baking a cake mean that that cake is going to taste any good? Just because you can answer questions from the back of a textbook, even using a spreadsheet and a computer, does that mean you can actually balance the books of a real small business? None of these examples use authentic assessment, or assessment that closely mimics the actual real-world usage of the skills and knowledge we are teaching our students. The objective for this lesson is to develop at least 2 different assessments to measure a given performance objective other than a traditional objective test. Have you ever had a bad test? Have you ever had a good test? What's the difference between a bad test and a good test? For me, it's not as simple as I do bad on bad tests and I do good on good tests, although that's usually the case. For me, a bad test doesn't test what the objectives say I should be able to do, while a good test does. While it's possible to assess many objectives using a multiple choice test, it's very difficult to do that at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which is where we want our students to be functioning. So we should come up with other ways of assessing students, in addition to, or even instead of, the multiple choice test. Remember Gagne's instructional events. The ones that involve assessing student performance include elicit performance, provide feedback, and assess performance. Those events are the ones in which we can employ authentic assessment techniques. What's the purpose of assessment? Why do we test students? Why do we assess them, other than to give them a grade? Traditional tests tend to be paper and pencil tests, or nowadays electronic versions of the same thing, but they emphasize breadth of knowledge over depth of knowledge. Students tend to answer a lot of multiple choice questions covering a wide range of knowledge without going very deep in any one area. Traditional tests tend to function at Bloom's knowledge, comprehension, and possibly the application level of instruction. Authentic tests, on the other hand, more closely match the outcome or the objective that we're trying to measure. If we're asking students to write a performance objective, an authentic assessment means they will actually write a performance objective. They're not going to answer multiple choice questions about performance objectives. They will have to actually write that objective. The objective that's being assessed is also based closer on real-world performance than the ones assessed by traditional tests. Traditional tests tend to test knowledge, comprehension, and application level objectives, but in the real world, people have to be able to function at the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation levels. To test that real-world performance, we have to use more authentic assessment. One of the reasons that authentic assessment can test at those upper levels is because it emphasizes depth over breadth. Instead of testing low-level objectives on many topics, it will focus on the higher-level objectives on a few topics, but those topics are the performances described in the performance objectives for the course. There are several types of authentic assessment. Here are a few of the most common. A performance assessment is having the student actually do what the objective says they can do. This is most commonly used for objectives in the psychomotor domain, but it's also appropriate for objectives in the cognitive domain. In a product assessment, students create projects based on one objective. These projects tend to be of a longer duration than something that takes place in a testing situation. And again, they emphasize depth over breadth. A portfolio assessment is a collection of student work over a course of a semester, where the work is sampled at different periods during the semester. This allows you to look at how the student has improved over the course of the semester. For example, in a writing course, a portfolio assessment may take samples of student writing over the course of the semester, and a grade could be assessed based on how that writing has improved. In problem-based assessment, students are given a very complex problem and they have to come up with a unique solution following good problem-solving methodology. Very often in problem-based assessment, the methodology is assessed as much as the solution to the problem is assessed. The problem has to be complex, and it doesn't have to be a math problem or an accounting problem or a physics problem. It can be a social science problem. For example, in a psychology class, students may be given a problem of bullying in schools and told to come up with a solution to help reduce the bullying problem in a given school district. With journal assessment, students are asked to reflect on a given topic. Again, generally this reflection takes place periodically over the course of a semester, and that reflection has very specific criteria that the students must meet. This type of assessment is very good for the affective domain, where we're trying to assess students' feelings and attitudes. This allows us to look at the change in feelings and attitudes over the course of a semester. How do you grade authentic assessments? It's very easy to grade a multiple choice test. It's either right or it's wrong. Authentic assessments need other ways to be graded. Checklists are good for assessments where certain things need to be present, and it's graded based on the presence or absence of that particular thing. It doesn't matter how good the student does on that particular item, it just has to be there or not be there. A Likert scale is a list of evaluation questions similar to a checklist, where you have a list of things that need to be answered, but in this case you have a scale, say 1 to 5 on each question, and you assess where the student falls on that scale for each particular evaluation criteria. A rubric takes that idea one step further and creates a chart for assessment. In a rubric, the performance criteria, or the criteria on which the student is being assessed, is listed on one axis, and on the other axis you have the level of performance. In each cell of the chart you'll usually have a description of that level of performance for a specific criterion. Rubrics are probably the most common way of grading authentic assessments, so let's look at those in a little more detail. To develop a rubric, you start by defining your objectives. We already know how to do that. Then you develop your performance criteria, or exactly what is it the student has to be able to do to meet that objective. Once you develop your performance criteria, select your levels of performance. You can define your levels of performance based on quality, frequency, or expertise. Once you do that, describe each performance criteria at each level of performance and assign point values. You might assign one measure for the entire rubric, which means if the student performs primarily at the excellent level, they get this grade. If they perform primarily at the good level, they get this grade. If they perform primarily at the fair level, they get this grade. And if most of their performance is at the poor level, they get this grade. You could also assign separate measures for each performance criterion. So they may perform well on one criterion and poorly on another, and they would get separate point values for each one of those. Add up the point values and you get the score for the overall rubric. Let's look at an example. In my online courses, I have students do what I call a In the News blog. Astronomy in the news, physical science in the news, and psychology in the news. Each week I give them a specific topic. They must find a current news article about that topic. When they find the article, they have to blog about it. Each of their blogs must include an introduction based on specific guidelines I give them, a summary, again, based on specific guidelines. They have to state one thing that they learned by reading the article, and they have to list a question that they still have after reading the article. Finally, they have to comment on at least 2 other blogs by other students. Those are the performance criteria. I have 3 levels of performance: acceptable, needs improvement, or proficient, and I have descriptions of what the performance is at each one of those levels. So for example, if the thing learned that they state is only minimally related to that topic for that week, they only get 2 points. Or if they don't comment on other blogs, they get 0 points. Once I've graded each one of those performance criteria, I add up all the total points, and that's their score for that blog. So let's look at matching assessments to objectives. We're going to look at the performance objective samples from the writing objectives lesson, and then select a method and a grading method. I'm going to tell you right now, there's no right answer on this. I'm going to give you some time to do each one, then I'll give you what my answer is. Remember, our assessment methods are performance, product, portfolio, problem-based, and journal, and our grading method is checklist, Likert scales, and rubrics. Let's look at our first objective. Receive, read, write, and send email to an individual, a group, and a mailing list using an email client of their choice. Take a few seconds to think about how you would assess this and how you would grade it. I would use a performance assessment. In other words, I would have them actually receive, read, write, and send an email to an individual, a group, and a mailing list. They can use whatever email client they want to be able to do that. In this case, I think this is a prime example of where you could use a checklist. Did they receive an email? Did they read it? Did they write it? Did they send it? Did they do that, each one of those for an individual, each one for a group, and each one for a mailing list? Yes or no? There's no degree of success on those, so a rubric isn't necessary, nor is a Likert scale. It's just a simple, did they do it or didn't they? Compare and contrast classical and operant conditioning, giving examples of each. This is an example of an objective from the psychology course I teach, and it's also an example of an essay question that they get on their midterm. I consider this to be a product. Their product is the answer to the essay question. And as a grading method, I use a very simple rubric. One performance criteria is comparing classical and operant conditioning. The second is contrasting the two. And the third is giving examples of each. My levels of performance are unacceptable, which is 0 points, acceptable, which is 1 point, and exemplar, which is 2 points, for a total of 6 points for that particular question. Write at least 2 different assessments to measure a given performance objective. I'm going to call this one more problem-based because it's fairly complex. The first step is you have to analyze the performance objective and decide what type of objective it is. Is it knowledge, comprehension, application, etc.? And based on that, decide what type of assessment is needed in order to measure that objective. You also need to decide how you're going to grade those assessments, and you have to do 2 of them that are different. To grade this problem-based assessment, I'd end up using a rubric that has those performance criteria listed on one side and the level of performance on the other, and I would clearly describe what those levels are so that you as the student would understand how you're going to be assessed. Assess the effect of gender, ethnicity, culture, or history on a given topic specific to your discipline, providing specific examples to support your analysis. I think this is a good candidate for a journal assessment. I think it would be very interesting to see how students' perspective of gender, ethnicity, culture, or history changes over the course of a semester when they're taking a course in psychology, sociology, history, and they're learning more and more about these issues and their effect on different disciplines. And again, I'd probably use a rubric to assess that. Okay, so for the objective you wrote and the one that you're going to teach in your 5-minute lesson, develop 2 assessment methods other than an objective test. Again, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and bring your assessment methods to the training on Wednesday.